Hello, John Perry here with Stated Casually. Welcome to another podcasty interview type video. Today's guest is comic book artist and science communicator Jordan Collver. He has recently completed a new comic book on the conflict between science and religion, or actually on what appears to be the lack of conflict between science and religion in the minds of religious people living in Canada and the UK. The comic gives a beautiful overview of a huge sociology study that was recently done, focusing on how evolution is perceived among religious folks outside of the US. Now, we are all painfully aware of how certain evangelical groups here in the US tend to deal with the theory of evolution. Flat-out denial of facts and evidence and the formation of these really well-funded, extremely dishonest organizations like Answers in Genesis that just blatantly lie to churchgoers and to the public at large. This silliness forces educators to engage in a never-ending wrestle with misinformation. It's very frustrating. It's been really interesting to see in this new research, however, that the circus of insanity we see here in the US, this is generally absent in Canada and in the UK, especially in the UK. Jordan and I talk about that, and we also give our origin stories. Both Jordan and I started out our lives as, I guess you could say, religious fanatics. I was a Mormon, and he was a young earth creationist. We talk about how we broke free from that indoctrination. It was just a super fun conversation. I don't know that I've got my origin story out publicly before this, so it's pretty cool. It's nice to get that off my chest, you know? We also talk about evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne. Now, for those who don't know him, he is an author and an evolutionary biologist whose work Jordan and I both love. He's written several books, and just as a researcher, I don't know another scientist that has been more productive throughout his career. Don't quote me on this number, but I think Jerry Coyne's written somewhere around 300 papers during his career. Most of his work focused on speciation, how it is that new species arise through the process of evolution. Extremely, extremely ambitious scientist. He's also got a blog called Why Evolution is True, which is also the title of one of his books. And it's a great blog. He's actually written about Stated Clearly videos. I think he's got 2 articles on some of my video work, which is nice. It's always nice to have my stuff reviewed by someone like him. Unfortunately, though, the stuff that we say about him isn't completely positive. Jerry Coyne has recently been giving advice to other researchers that I think is extremely, extremely detrimental. If people were to actually listen to his advice and do the thing that he is telling them to do, I honestly think this could set back the field of evolutionary biology, 10 years or so. It could be very, very bad. So that's a controversial opinion, obviously. And we talk about that and its implications. And I'm curious to see how people respond to that in the comments section. That'll be interesting. As usual for these longer conversations, I recommend listening while driving or cooking or working out, doing something. Because it's about, I think it ended up being over almost 2 hours long. If you listen to it instead of watching, you will miss out on seeing some of Jordan's artwork, which is unfortunate. But we do describe what's on screen so that if you happen to be listening, you won't get totally lost. Quick word of warning, the audio is not perfect. We recorded online since we don't live on the same continent. And also, I was dealing with a squeaky chair the entire time, so my apologies for that. But don't worry, your ears will quickly get used to it. So without further ado, here is the man, Jordan Collver. Welcome, Jordan, to your very first ever Stated Casually podcasty interview type video.
Hello.
Jordan, as you probably know, he does a lot of illustrations for Stated Clearly for our animations. I've been working with, how long have we been working together?
I think I started volunteering with you about 2014. So yeah. About 4 years.
Yeah, and now that we have people on Patreon, now I can actually pay you. But we are here to talk about Jordan's comic, which I love, by the way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so this is a project that I started working on. Gosh, I guess it's basically a year ago. I started working on it last August, finished it around February, released it online, and then had it published in May-ish in print form, which John was just holding up there. So this is a project completely separate from Stated Clearly, just so that everyone listening has that kind of clear. So this is just something that I worked on with a research project based in the UK, which is where I live, by the way. So I have a Canadian accent, but I live in Bristol in the United Kingdom. And in Birmingham University, there is a university called Newman, and they have a research project called Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum, which I think tells you quite a lot just there, but it looks specifically at research within the United Kingdom and Canada. So it excludes the United States, which I'm sure we can talk a little bit about more later. But I basically started working with them to do a comic about their research. So they had something called a media fellowship grant. They hired somebody to do, I think, a YouTube video. And I proposed doing a comic because that's what I do. I like to make comics. I like to use art to talk about science or other complicated ideas, as of course, Stated Clearly is also fond of doing. Yeah. And yeah, just try and unpick this a little bit. And it was a really interesting journey because their research is quite sprawling. It's interdisciplinary, so it brings in lots of threads from all over the place. And it was actually quite challenging for my own kind of personal views and stuff because it really zooms in on a lot of those preconceptions and stuff that we might have about this pretty thorny issue.
It's mostly sociologists, is that right?
The bulk of it is sociology, but they also have psychologists, so experimental social psychologists, and historians. So that look at history. And in terms of the sociology, they'll have quantitative sociologists, i.e. people who are gathering data about, through big surveys and stuff. So if you've ever done like a public opinion survey, that kind of thing. And then qualitative. So digging in a little bit deeper about interviewing people, having focus groups, and these interviews can last for hours at a time, just really kind of delving underneath what somebody might just tick a little box on a survey. Well, what do you mean by that? And then really, really dig in. So yeah, it sort of tackles it from all those different angles.
But their main question is, how is it that people are dealing with conflicts between science and religion? So when a scientific concept comes in conflict with a religious doctrine, how do people actually deal with that in the real world, as opposed to simply rejecting the science or rejecting the religion? What else are people doing?
That's right. Or even more broadly, then how do they deal with the conflict between science and religion? Maybe even more broadly, it's asking, do people perceive there to be a conflict between science and religion?
Okay.
And I think it's a different question, and this becomes quite relevant as we can see later on. But this becomes quite relevant because it is not asking, are science and religion compatible, or is there a conflict between them? But within society, how are people thinking about this issue? So it's looking at real world data about how people actually think about this. So I mean, like if we were to put this into a tweet format, the research is kind of saying when it comes to religious attitudes on science, specifically evolution, that they're kind of zooming in on, a lot of the time there's a mismatch between kind of societal expectations and the actual experience of religious people. People deal with, as you just said, discrepancies between scientific findings on the one hand and the religious teachings from whatever tradition they're coming from in complicated ways, and they're hardly ever in like an either or fashion. It's not these mutually exclusive categories that might happen in perhaps, or what we might want to happen from an academic perspective, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So they're not asking, is the theory of evolution compatible with Genesis 1? They're not asking that question. They're asking, do people feel like it is? Or how do people react to?
Yeah, or is that even relevant to them? Because as they found, for a lot of religious people, evolution is just a lot less relevant than you'd think, or at least certainly than I thought. I mean, I used to be a creationist. Right. For me, there has always been that conflict between the religious kind of doctrines that I had been taught and what it meant to be a Christian, right? And what it meant to read the book of Genesis, and then science, specifically evolution. So to me, that conflict was very real and it was tangible. It impacted a lot of the direction of my life. And so I assumed that that's the case for all religious people. How can you possibly, accept evolution and be a religious person? And if you are, you're just sort of watering one or the other down beyond any recognition. And at that point, what's the point? You're not a real Christian, or it's not really evolution, which doesn't look like it's the case, at least not here in the UK and Canada. So I think for the duration of this conversation, I'm just going to drop that caveat. So again, it's a slightly unique situation in the United States compared to other countries. There's a lot of cultural influence. Having said that, that does come into Canada, that does come over into the UK.
From the US, yeah.
Exactly, from the US. But I think it's important to kind of realize that most of the research on this subject about, the sociology of science and religion comes from a US lens, right? So you're taking this pretty fraught, pretty unique social, historical situation and applying it to a lot of other countries and just assuming that that's the case. Being an immigrant coming from Canada to the UK, I assumed that my little subculture bubble, that same kind of thing applied to the UK. And I think I'm very pleased to report it doesn't seem to be the case. And that's good news as far as I'm concerned.
You and I have a kind of a similar background with evolution. I was raised Mormon. I'm no longer religious either. So you're no longer religious. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So both of us were raised religious, and religion impeded our ability to study biology. For me, I had a Sunday school teacher when I was a little kid who told me that scientists are going to teach you about evolution to try to trick you into believing that Jesus is not real. That's what I was told when I was like 5 years old by a Sunday school teacher. Turns out that's not the actual position of the Mormon Church. The Mormon Church is officially pretty lenient with evolution, but my Sunday school teacher wasn't. And so I heard that as a little kid, and I was terrified. Whenever in classrooms, whenever we were going to study science, I would start to get scared and get anxious. I finally heard about evolution for the first time watching a David Attenborough documentary, and it just blew my mind. I was like, whoa, this makes so much sense. I was pretty scared to study it because of this warning that I got from my teacher. Yeah, I remember reading the encyclopedia. We had an encyclopedia at our house, and I would read about evolution, and if someone would walk in on me, I'd slam it shut like it was a dirty magazine or something.
Hiding it under your mattress.
Were you raised young Earth creationist? I mean, like,
yeah. So a lot of what you've just said, like, is so familiar to my experience as well. For viewers or listeners who are familiar with John Casually channel, his Ark Encounter videos, you may have heard of Ken Ham. And like I watched Ken Ham videos in Sunday school, like that. Again, whether or not that was the position of my church overall, it was certainly the church library had the VHS tapes. We watched those during Sunday school. So very much that kind of became part of my psyche as a kid. I also went to a kind of an evangelical Christian school, like a private primary school. And I mean, I remember in our science class, so broadly, we would just never discuss evolution, right? We would just learn about biology or learn about, cell biology, whatever, but just not within the framework of evolution. Baseline understanding that evolution was a hoax, not necessarily a hoax, but just it was a sinful delusion, if that makes sense. And I mean, I have a memory of we got some new biology textbooks, and we went through with permanent markers and crossed out every instance of modified or evolved and replaced it with specialized or created. It wasn't an adaptation that a certain animal had to its environment. It was specialized for its environment. Just subtle things like that. But that's certainly, that's there. And you mentioned David Attenborough, exactly like that. I loved nature when I was a kid, still do, of course. But yeah. I would devour nature books. I broke the spines in all of these like wildlife picture books and stuff, and would watch a lot of documentaries. And then, whenever evolution or millions or billions of years would pop up in the text or during Attenborough's narration, for example, it just sort of became white noise to me, something that I'd decide while taking in the rest of the information, sort of a little bit, I guess a good comparison would be like if we're reading an out of date science book that's still broadly accurate, you read certain bits of information, you're like, oh, well, that part's nonsense, but then this is still good and this is still good. It was sort of like that, but otherwise everyone I knew in my social circles were Christians. They believed the same thing as me, so I didn't really even encounter what evolution really was. So it was easy to reject because I was basically presented the straw man version of what evolution was.
So when did that change for you? When were you like, wait a minute, there's something here?
So the first thing I remember where I was maybe actually presented with what evolution was in a non-straw man way, I was in high school. So let's say grade 10 or 11. I'd made some friends who were very science literate. One is now a paleontologist in British Columbia, which is awesome. So the kid who's like always drawing dinosaurs in the margins of the notebook and like wears dinosaur t-shirts to school and stuff. Now it's paleontologist, so that's cool. But yeah, so I remember one day they sort of like, I guess in a friendly way, tolerated my like evangelical creationist sensibilities. But I must have said something, and they basically sort of like pinned me against the wall and just explained what evolution was. Actually quite clear, concise way that sort of stuck with me, because I remember thinking that kind of makes sense and also isn't what I thought it was. I was under the indeed quite common misconception that evolution was a process of, that had goals or intent. Like I think I said to them, like how does a lizard know when it needs to, grow frills or whatever because the environment's changing? That can't happen. Like you can't just change your body because you want to do something. And they're like, no, that's not how evolution works. Individual organisms don't know what they're doing. Like these are random variations between offspring and parent. And they got me to acknowledge, yeah, okay, I can concede that there are slight differences between one generation and the next. And then they sort of walked me through, well, can't you see then how if the environment were to change slightly, some might fare better in that environment than others because of those variations? I was like, yeah, okay. And then, you extrapolate that over long stretches of time, which I wasn't able to do because I still rejected, geological lengths of time. I mean, yeah, I was operating within like a 6,000 to 10,000 year framework here. So, but anyway, that was maybe the first time, that it actually kind of got through that filter, and made me think about it.
Yeah.
And, the nerd that I am, like throughout high school, from let's say grade 12, 11 and 12 into the kind of early years of my university, I was working on this document where I was basically trying to make a case for how evolution, of course it's fake and the scientists are wrong, but if they aren't wrong, this is maybe how it could fit in with what Genesis says, or what my theological framework was, which, without boring you all, was essentially, I believed in sort of like a fully sovereign God who had his providential hand involved in like every orbit of every electron every second. Like if it wasn't for his control over the laws of nature, the universe would just fly apart. So I was like, well, if he controls the orbit of an electron, surely evolution, could be fully guided and by his hand in the exact same way that we can still say he created those creatures, even though it happened through a process. You look at texts in the Bible and it say God, he tips over the jars of heaven and it rains. And I was thinking like, that's a poetic way of describing it. We now understand that, like how the water cycle works, but no one's like, oh, there's no God because there's a water cycle. Checkmate, creation.
Right.
I think maybe evolution could be the same thing. And then I had like this really long paragraph at the end where I was basically just like apologizing to my own psyche, saying, but of course that's all nonsense. The Bible's literally true. And, this is just a thought exercise and that kind of stuff, because I was really paranoid. So
that's really interesting. It's also interesting that you made a secret document and then in it, you had to backpedal on your own thought process. But
yeah, well, because like it was heresy from that's literally
right.
that was a political idea from the kind of theological upbringing I had. So I was really quite precious about it. I did show it to a few people just to get their thoughts, but this thing was like 40 pages long, so I'm not, I don't expect anyone to have actually read it.
You're no longer religious. Was evolution a direct reason that you gave up your religion, or was it a side thing? I'm curious what your actual personal experience was with that.
Yeah. So that's an idea that I was told is like the slippery slope, right? So first you entertain evolution, and then the next thing you're getting rid of Adam and Eve, and then the next thing blah blah blah, and then you're an atheist. Presto. Yeah. And we were warned against that, I think, in a similar way you were from your Sunday school teacher. But in point of fact, like that is kind of, in my case, how it worked out. That's the trajectory I followed. On the other hand, it would be an overstatement to say like that was all because of evolution. So yes. I would say my increasing understanding and acceptance of evolution kind of came in tandem with a whole constellation of other things that was happening kind of in my personal life at the time. And by personal life, I mean my internal thinking about these things. So I was starting to, a lot of things, I started going to university and I studied history. And I did that because I wanted to prove that the Bible was the inerrant word of God. And, that the historical record talked about the Bible was true and all of this stuff. Incidentally, I would have liked a biology or zoology degree, but I didn't want to learn about secular propaganda when I went to university. So that's like a big regret of mine. Looking back, I'm like, oh man, I wish I did a zoology degree. But so anyway, so I started to realize once I started to kind of look at, what is a good historical source? What can we know about history? What's considered good evidence? What is evidence? What are standards of evidence? Critical thinking, all of these things. I mean, these were new ideas to me. And I was like 19 years old. And these are the first time I was really, really starting to do that. So that started to creep in and I started to go, oh, shoot. Like even the professor who's talking to me, and she was a nun, I think. She was going, yeah, no, of course the Bible isn't like perfectly accurate. And this part here probably never happened. And Jericho was a real city, but we have no evidence that the biblical account of the walls crumbling down and all that, like that happened. And I was like, what? So, that's one example. Like that was one thing. And then I was also learning more about science and really sort of becoming more open to that. In answer to your question, it wasn't just evolution, but evolution, I think, was like a bit player. A lot of times people are like, they'll even just believe in an abstract idea of God just to explain like, well, where did life come from and why are we all here? And I got to the point where I was sort of like, well, I can imagine a world, this is still quite early on, I can imagine a world where it did just unfold through natural laws. And, what do you do with that? Like God was less necessary at that point.
Yeah, for me, I remember the very first time that I doubted the religious claims that I was brought up with was when I learned how mountains form. Because it wasn't the specific science of how mountains form. The realization that I made was when we study something scientifically, the more you pick it apart, the more solid it is, the more sense it makes. And it was the opposite with religion. So I had these diagrams of how plate tectonics work, and they push and mountains form. And when I was looking at those diagrams, it made the text make a whole lot of sense, and it made it really believable. And when I went out into the mountains, we actually had a it was a church event where we climbed this mountain, and then we had a Bible study at the top where we read about the creation. One girl brought a photo or a painting. It was a painting of Jesus building the world, and he's like in outer space, and there's wind blowing through his hair. And I'm pretty sure there's not wind in space, maybe solar wind.
Duh.
and there's like lightning and like smoke, and he's building the earth. And I'm like, the creation story in the Bible makes more sense when you don't add a picture. It's more believable when it's really flowery and vague. the more clearly you state religion, the sillier it sounds. The more clearly you state how science works, the more obvious it is that this is, that mountains formed through plate tectonics. Yeah, that was the thing for me. So I really couldn't say evolution is what made me leave my religion. It was just this understanding how to think critically.
Yeah, that's it.
Pray to the Lord for strength.
I don't believe in God. I believe in science.
Also with like history and stuff like that, you've got historians now that are very careful of what they write. They're very careful about how accurate their portrayal of an event is. And you know that was not happening with the people who are writing the Bible. They didn't have that standard of journalism, right?
That's exactly it. I mean, I think probably the biggest, maybe I'd be remiss without mentioning the biggest influence probably that sums up kind of exactly what you're saying, is I started reading, and this was in university as well, The Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan. And that was probably like the first really clear presentation of what science was that I had up until that point. What is science? How does it work? And, this self-correcting mechanism where, it changes and it gets things wrong. But then with every, new iteration of our knowledge, it's a closer approximation, ideally, towards, what you might call truth or reality. And that seemed to really gel with me. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And it was in stark contrast into what my beliefs were about religion, which is that they're eternal, unchanging. Like, this is the truth. It doesn't change. And that becomes difficult when you start to have problems with certain things in it, right? Like, yeah, the closer you look, the lower the resolution gets. Whereas, science, it seems, it just works. And the proof is in the pudding. You start examining something, and these were things that I was looking into because I thought they were baloney, right? I actually tried to learn as much as I could about evolution because I thought it was wrong, and I tried to learn as much about religion, about my faith and my theological beliefs, and make internal sense of that because I thought it was right. But the more I did that, the more I became convinced that it wasn't right, and the more I looked at the thing I thought was not right, the more I became convinced that was. I can't pinpoint a time where I sort of like switched from one to the other, because very much like sort of the thesis of this research, which is that like it's quite a blurry spectrum, and you ask somebody kind of, there's no clear dividing mark, and I sort of manifested that by blurring slowly this transitional species from one to the other, geological time, and just like an evolutionary lineage, it becomes problematic when you start going, that species is different from that, and that one's, it's so imperceptible you can't even really notice it. But I do know that when I was about 25 years old, so that's only about 5 years ago, I'd been a non-believer for a few years by then, ostensibly. But I drafted like a coming out letter to my family, to try and set the record straight and stuff. Incidentally, I never sent it, but there you go, kind of as a benchmarker.
Do they know that you're no longer religious?
A couple of my closest friends do, like who I went to church and stuff with. I figured I could tell them, and two of my siblings, but not my parents.
Now you just announced it on the Stated Casually interview podcast thingy.
I mean, my mom, who doesn't know how to turn a PC on, will find her way to Stated Casually. Pretty low, but
well, millions of people are going to watch this video. So
I did write those. I mean, part of this I use. So it's subtitled "Living Along the Spectrum of Science and Religion,"
right,
to kind of talk a little bit about that. I use my personal kind of story just as a narrative hook. It's relevant to my life, and so I kind of inject a couple little personal bits of commentary in there, and some of which I actually wrote specifically with my family in mind, in the hopes that they would read it. I gave them, actually, they just came to visit me England a few weeks ago, and I gave them hard copies. So nice. I'll be interested to see what they think of it.
Oh, they haven't given you feedback yet?
Nope, not yet. But I mean, yeah, it's not the main thrust of the book, but I do suspect that they may even object to the, their interpretation would be you can't really be a true Christian and believe in evolution as a lot of the people here in the UK do. And that's kind of what the data shows.
Let's dig into the comic and talk about what's your tweet description, your tweet version description of this comic book?
I literally wrote, I tried to make it exactly tweet. So here it is. I'll just read it. When it comes to religious attitudes on religion, there's often a mismatch between societal expectations and the actual experience of individuals. People deal with discrepancies between scientific findings and religious teachings in complicated ways, rarely in an either-or fashion, or either-or.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like the research conducted by the Science and Religion Exploring the Spectrum Project, which I'll just call SRES, SRES from now on, because that's quicker. Their research kind of challenges the view that in society, there's an inherent conflict between science and religion, which again is something that I just took for granted. And instead it kind of shows that a lot of the assumptions that I had, and I think a lot of people have about religious people when it comes to their attitude about evolution, i.e. that they are anti-science or that they reject evolution, to say the least, that doesn't really line up with the actual numbers when you go out there and ask individuals what they actually think about evolution. So the research kind of suggests that those anti-science views, they're real, they are there, but it's certainly a minority belief in the UK and Canada. I think their findings was that it was around 9% of people who actually reject evolution. So that doesn't include people who accept evolution but think it was guided by God, but they still accept that evolution happened and it's over millions of years, and it's how scientists describe it. They just kind of, attach that theological interpretation to it as well. As a result, as well, that kind of anti-science creationism is also overrepresented in the media and in popular thinking,
and in my YouTube comments.
And in the YouTube comments, yeah, I mean, it doesn't take long for it to just evolve into science is good, religion is bad, or the other way around, depending on who's commenting, and then not being able to look past what's actually being said. So the good news is, though, that in the UK and Canada, religious people aren't rejecting science because of their faith. And they aren't really even rejecting evolution, right? It's not just science. They're not even rejecting evolution because of their faith.
That's something I'd like to point out here. And I'm not sure how well they, in their research, differentiated the two, but I've found that people, even hardcore young Earth creationists, are usually not anti-science. They're anti-biology. Basically, they don't like evolution.
I want to point out a specific, let's see, it may not show up on the screen, and in fact, if people are just kind of listening in, I rendered in sort of a very imprecise form a really interesting graph that they have. If you look at people's reported perceived reliability of different scientific disciplines, so like evolution, medicine, chemistry, biology, physics, genetics, climate science, and psychology.
Yeah.
Of the people who find it difficult to accept evolution or easy to accept evolution, on all the other categories, there's a very small difference in the perceived reliability, so of only a few percent. So they basically, people who find it very difficult to accept evolution, the outlier is evolution, and they basically trust the rest of science just as much as, which is interesting, right? There's something else going on with science. So
the creationist movement, like the big people up there, up the top, like Ken Ham and so on, sometimes they'll go full on anti-science, and then other times they're trying to tell people that most science is okay. It's just evolution. So it's interesting. And it's interesting how that trickles down to the public. And because obviously all of us, when we make a decision in our normal day-to-day lives, we use data that we pull in through our five senses. And then we use critical thinking, not always, but we use the scientific method all the time. And it's appealing to us,
There's obviously something kind of weird because you go, well, like, why would it be so different for evolution compared to these other forms of science? But I think that's really interesting because there is something else going on there, and they sort of examine that a little bit more in depth from a psychological point of view with a different strand of the research. But before we talk about that, I think it would just be, it definitely bears mentioning that I mentioned the two categories of people who find it easy or difficult to accept evolution. it would be easy to think, oh, the ones who find it difficult to accept evolution, those are all the religious people. But that's not the people who find it difficult to accept evolution. That's only 19% of religious people in the UK. So more religious people find it easy to accept evolution than difficult. And I think there's about 48% of the population in the UK who identify as religious. So even that number is much lower than in the States, as you can see. 48% of people identify as religious. Of that 48%, 19% find it difficult to accept evolution. That's not even saying that they don't accept it. That's just saying that they find it difficult.
Did they find any percentage of non-religious people that were rejecting evolution?
Yeah, they did. I didn't really get the opportunity to kind of talk about all the outliers, but there are lots of weird outliers, and they tend to be within the non-religious camp. So you'll have, people who like strongly identify with being an atheist and stuff, but they might reject evolution or have like really, really weird beliefs about evolution, like
aliens
and stuff. Yeah. So, overall,
I have a couple of friends that are, well, I did a video, an interview with Suzanne, who believes very strongly in aliens. When I was doing the Paracas skull stuff, and she's interesting because I would say she's an atheist, but she's like part of this new age spiritual alien movement. So it's
also a big subculture of conspiracy theorists within. It's not what I would say is like true skepticism, because they're obviously not applying, but they're sort of being skeptical of mainstream science, and like they subscribe to a lot of these conspiracy theories, but that is in no way connected to religion as such. Maybe you might argue that they're the same kind of thought patterns and like not applying critical thinking to those standards of evidence and stuff, but you certainly can't say that's because of religion that they're rejecting vaccines, or that they're rejecting climate science, or that they're rejecting or accepting aliens and all these weird kind of conspiracy things. I mean, I shouldn't just weird, but
with the new atheist movement, there's been this kind of, what Christopher Hitchens says, that religion poisons everything. And I agree with much of that sentiment, having been raised Mormon and having had what I think were a lot of problems that are because of that I witnessed. But it's very, very clear to me that getting rid of religion doesn't get rid of the craziness that is the human mind. I mean, there are so many weird ideas and dangerous ideas that people will accept, and possibly even more readily in a vacuum. People don't necessarily give up their religion for a better, more critical, thoughtful view of reality. Sometimes they just don't find religion appealing and find other things appealing instead. White supremacy, or just all kinds of weird stuff.
Well, actually, that's pretty interesting you mentioned that specifically, because I mean, it seems to be in a lot of cases where these things happen, it's because of a desire for, in that case, supremacy or specialness, or whatever your chosen group is. I mean, broadly speaking, just human uniqueness and human privilege puts a weird spin on a lot of things. If people are uncomfortable with the idea that humans are part of the tree of life, just like every other, naturally originating species, but they don't believe in God and they don't believe in the Bible, but still want to feel that sense of specialness. Well, of course, we come from a different lineage from all the rest of the animals because aliens tampered with their DNA, or we have a completely different kind of line anyway. So it seems like where people are struggling with evolution, it's often because it has implications like that cut to the core of what it means to be human, or how we think of ourselves. And these issues are present in non-believers as well. I talk about that in the comic too. Speaking of anomalies, in some of the survey data, where people who accept evolution and they accept and believe in human evolution also then say that, or they agree with the statement that evolution can't explain human origins, or agree with the statement that evolution can't explain human consciousness. It just makes a great deal of sense, because you're talking about animals, you're talking about plants. Yeah, sure, no problem, whatever. as soon as people are in the mix, as soon as people are involved, then we're like, wait a minute, what? Then you really pay attention. It has personal relevance to me. Like, wait a minute. So I'm just like evolved from the ooze or molecules to man or whatever kind of the parody kind of characterizations that people like Ken Ham often try and peddle, which is meant to be derogatory, I think, like that we came from animals. It's like whether or not you think that is a bad thing, I think is open to interpretation. But yeah.
Are there any parts of the comic that I can show on the screen, but I want us to describe it well enough that people that are just listening can understand too. But any parts of this comic that you really want to highlight?
I could talk a lot about the research itself, but what I think I'd probably want to highlight overall, and I kind of devote a little, I split the comic up into different sections. There's sort of different themes. So one about looking a little bit more in the data itself, other ones that are looking at, what it means to be human and stuff, as we just talked about. One about cognitive dissonance, sort of what's going on inside people's heads, and the idea that it's actually more about social dissonance more than an internal cognitive dissonance. But I think what I'd like to highlight overall was what I was sort of personally grappling with throughout my exploration of the comic. So if I may, maybe I'll just read little bits of that and then we can talk about it. So I have a little panel of me thinking, and then there is a Buddhist monk sort of sitting with his legs crossed, just thinking and meditating. And then we have a scientist who's got a magnifying glass, like lifting up a rock and looking at a fossil. And I ask, as I reflect on all this research, one persistent question kept surfacing in my mind. Is it true? Are science and religion compatible? After all, they're two completely different ways of knowing. And there are plenty of valid philosophical and theological debates to be had about their truth claims. However, this research isn't about what is right, with a little trademark sign, in an objective metaphysical sense. That's a very interesting and important question in its own right, but one for a separate conversation. And here I have a little statue of the Veritas statue, which sits actually outside the Canadian Supreme Court. So Veritas is truth. So this sort of embodiment of this philosophical idea of truth. Instead, the research approach of the SRES project is designed to view the subject from a different vantage altogether, one that focuses on the subjective lived experience of real people rather than abstract ideas. And here I shift the camera focus to be behind the shoulder of this Veritas statue to focus on a convicted criminal and his lawyer walking up the steps. So the implication is slightly different. And then this is a quote from one of the researchers named Dr. Alex Hall. He says, "There's plenty of work that does address the philosophical and theological, and we're by no means saying that isn't valuable work. But there's a huge vacuum where it's going from that step to media coverage without ever asking, well, what are the numbers? What do people actually think about this?" So, there are people who devote their entire academic livelihoods, build careers debating about, are science and religion compatible? They might be philosophers. They might be scientists. They might write very long books about the issue. And it's basically going, yeah, that's an important conversation that we need to have, but that's not what we're doing. That's sort of been, that is being done. The bases are covered. But what there's been less attention devoted to is, the day-to-day views of, rather than the abstractions, the philosophical ideas. And there are a couple of panels where I'm wandering through the Newman University campus. That's where the project is based. I was really struck by a particular situation of two buildings, a laboratory building on the one side, and just opposite it was a chapel, I think. And I say here, so maybe there should be a conflict between science and religion by some people's theoretical accounts. But in terms of the actual day-to-day lives of the vast majority of Britons and Canadians, there just isn't. Regardless of any intellectual differences that may exist between them, I've come to accept that science and religion can and do share the same space. And here I just kind of show in perspective those two buildings right beside each other. That lab I mentioned is actually called the Darwin Building, and it's beside. And that was real. I mean, as a visual metaphor, I thought that was quite striking. Now, I'm not suggesting, as some people have pointed out, I'm not suggesting that if two university buildings are geographically beside each other, then that means they have to like agree and that kind of stuff. I'm just saying it struck me as a nice symbol to see these two things and talk about them sharing the same space. And remember, again, as I say, I'm not saying that they should share the same space. I'm not saying that they need to share the same space. And I'm talking about the same space socially, not just geographically. I'm saying they can and do.
The reality of our situation right now, whether or not religion is just absolute garbage, we should throw it away, that hasn't happened yet. So we've got the two. We've got people accepting both in their brains at the same time. They might be juggling the two with cognitive dissonance. They might be doing what you tried to do to try and reconcile the two through some sort of logical explanation. Or they might just be like, oh, yeah, I believe that on Sunday and this on Monday.
That doesn't necessarily make sense to me. Like, being perfectly blunt, I don't happen to think that science and religion are compatible or that they can be harmonized as such. You know, I think that they are different and conflicting ways of knowing. Their epistemologies, their approach to how and what we can know about the world are very different.
Well, they certainly conflict in certain areas. I mean,
yeah. Well, where religious claims make claims that infringe on scientific knowledge. So, if a truth claim is made about something about the world or the way nature works, for example, well, that can be testable by science. And there are a lot of writers who've talked about that. But so I think that is the main thing that I kind of really grappled with and then came to terms with in looking at the evidence presented by this research project, which is like, I couldn't do it. I couldn't fit evolution and science more broadly into my Christian worldview that I had. So one or the other did need to go for me. Like I did demand an internal consistency that I guess a lot of people don't necessarily require. They're perfectly happy to kind of find some form of rough coherence. It works for them. It didn't work for me. So you can't really refute that at a certain point. If you have the majority of the population saying, yeah, no, it's not a problem for me. You can't then go, yeah, but it is though, isn't it? You do have a problem. And they're like, no, it's fine. I'm cool. And you go, oh yeah, I read you. You've got a problem with it. At that point, you're just sort of like willfully rejecting.
Well, you're just projecting your own. Yeah, you're projecting yourself into someone else, which is
you're projecting your own views on what other people are actually thinking, which is problematic. And guess what? People do that on both sides, right? And that's the problem. Like at that point, that's almost just fundamentalism. I think that's kind of problematic because it's essentially making the same mistake that Ken Ham is making, where Ken Ham says, if you're a Christian, you can't believe in science. And then you have maybe a science advocate saying, if you believe in science, you can't be a Christian. And if you're people like John, like you or I were when we were kids, that was deeply problematic. Like, heck, maybe we would have just accepted evolution long ago as kids. And we wouldn't have had to go through this weird, like twisted, awfully painful process of getting there where we did need to discard one or the other, but shouldn't be necessary.
Yeah, so I get accused a lot of accommodationism. Is that how you say it? On my Ark Encounter videos, I'm very nice, and I kind of bend over backwards to be nice, even though there's not much nice to say, especially about Ken Ham. But I'm not doing that for Ken Ham. I'm not trying to be nice to Ken Ham. I'm trying to be nice to the people that have been scammed by him and are tricked into that, and come at this from some respect for those people because they're not dumb people. They've had the straw man explanation of evolution fed to them, and they think that everybody who's trying to teach evolution is like secretly hates their God and is trying to ruin their lives. And that's like, I genuinely just want to teach biology. That is genuinely my goal. I really, and I like people to be able to know what parts of their worldview are beliefs, hope-based beliefs, you could say faith-based, hope-based, whatever, and what parts of their worldview are actually founded in observation. And because they're founded in observation, can be argued, and other people will actually be convinced by those arguments. The hope-based beliefs that we have in our lives, you can't convince somebody else that they should believe that too. But a fact-based belief description of the world based on actual facts that you can show somebody, those can be presented and debated, and you can actually come to an agreement because we all have the same senses and we all, gather information in pretty much the same way. Being able to know the difference between those two things in your own life. Like, I have a lot of hope-based beliefs, I suppose you could say that I hoped when I first started my YouTube channel that all the hours I was pouring into doing this animation would pay off and people would watch it, that first animation. And there was no evidence that was the case, These non-fact based beliefs are super common in everybody's worldview. And for me, it's trying to help people see the difference between those two.
It's realizing that a lot of these non-fact based beliefs form, in a lot of cases, they form a critical part of people's identity, who they are or who their community is. And that's no less relevant for people like the followers of Ken Ham, of which I was a part, I suppose you could say, as really anybody else. Indeed, that's some of what the research touches on as well, which is essentially that apart from the factfulness of different beliefs, a lot of the times whether someone accepts or rejects those facts has less to do with maybe the convincingness of the arguments or indeed the truthfulness of the arguments as it does how that relates to who they perceive themselves to be, what kind of group they belong to. So that can happen to anyone. And I think realizing that at a human level and maybe just having some compassion for the people who are in maybe a camp that you disagree with, a lot of the times it might not necessarily be because of the reasons you think. There's a lot more going beneath the surface than just they're being ignorant or they're not intelligent or they hate science. There's a lot more to it than that. There's really complicated psychological and social factors, just like these massive swelling undercurrents that, pull people in different directions that unless you're aware of them, I think you could, spend a lot of energy swimming against the current and not really even realizing it's there. So strategies to take that into account and work around it, I think, is really important.
Yeah, for me, the reason that I'm not willing to just flat out make fun of Ken Ham and the videos that I make about him is because he's one of these kind of alpha figures that gets a lot of people to follow him. He's kind of like a Donald Trump figure, and that people will follow him for his personality, and they'll end up like loving him and adoring him. If I were to just make fun of him, I immediately turn all those people off. Like, I'm not going to make fun of the guy. I'm going to systematically critique the things that he's saying, or just analyze the things that he's saying. And that's had a pretty big impact. I've actually received several letters from people saying, hey, thanks for making a video about this that I could actually show to my friends and family.
Yeah. Even as an individual, it just might make the individual more willing to listen to the rest of the video.
Yeah.
Instead of just go, oh, he's making fun of my guy or making fun of my belief. I'm just going to turn it off because I've heard this before. I mean, let's be honest. I think we would all do that as well, right? If someone just starts, I don't know, tearing to shreds, Charles Darwin was a pervert, and you would just be like, "Wow, okay, I'm just not even gonna listen."
Right. So, Jordan, there's been some critique of your comic saying that it's an accommodationist piece. Jerry Coyne has written about it. Jerry Coyne is an absolutely wonderful evolutionary biologist. The research that he's done is amazing. Several of his books I've read, one of his technical books on species, and then his Why Evolution is True. But he absolutely hates the Templeton Foundation. And there are some good reasons that he's upset with what they're doing. But I believe he saw that your comic was partly funded by the Templeton Foundation. And when he read it, he was very uncharitable. I think he misinterpreted a lot of things in this because of his past experience with that foundation. So I was wondering if you could talk about the Templeton Foundation, how involved they were with this, and even if you know much about them anyways. I mean, they funded this in part. So
Sure. Yeah, well, firstly, I think it's kind of a shame that happened because I could tell, I'm not going to take it personally, what sort of his take on the comic was. Suffice it to say, he didn't like it. But it was a shame that I could tell that he seemed to think as a result of the funding that had somehow colored what it was trying to say. And certainly me, because I actually, I had no idea of what the Templeton Foundation was beforehand. I think I was aware of some vague sense that there was a controversy surrounding it. The name rang a bell, and I could see that it had sort of struck a nerve with a lot of the people in the comments section as well. So I did think that was kind of a shame, because I think they thought I was trying to sneak in some kind of covert Christian apologetics or something like that.
The Templeton Foundation has been, like, John Templeton himself was an evangelical Christian at one time, but then he started kind of trying to do what you were doing in your paper that you wrote when you were in high school, where he's trying to find ways like to, religion's still important, but the science is really important. We shouldn't reject the science. So he was really interested in trying to find this way to kind of marry the two. And if you know anything about the history of science, it took us a long time to really separate the two in the first place. And to try to marry the two together really is a dangerous idea. It potentially could set things back quite a bit. And a lot of people worry that that's what the Templeton Foundation is trying to do. And there are some projects they've funded that do seem to kind of do that do seem to be kind of Trojan horses, I guess, trying to pull religion into science. But one of the interesting things about this, though, is that if you talk to Ken Ham at the Creation Museum, he has a whole exhibit about how the Templeton Foundation is evil. And he thinks it's a Trojan horse trying to pull science into religion.
Oh, no.
So both sides...
literature, that's known as like a wedge, right? Where you start with a little fine point, and then you wheedle your way in, and then it gets wider and wider, and you can allow more influence with science. So they call it a wedge tactic. So is Jerry Coyne's critique of them that they're trying to do that, I guess?
Yeah, so he has a legitimate concern with them. He's worried that they are trying to pull religion, Christianity specifically, and dump that into the scientific world. The Templeton Foundation funds a lot of things on prayer and, like, does prayer work and so on. The thing about the Templeton Foundation is that it works like any grant does. You have an idea, you want to do some research. If it fits, if it seems to fit, or you can make it fit what the people that have all the money want to spend their money on, you apply for the grant, you get the grant, and then you do the research. But the grant doesn't tell you what your conclusions are going to be.
Right.
And so far as I know, no one's reporting that the Templeton Foundation forces them to conclude a certain thing. I suppose if you come to conclusions they don't like, they might just not fund you on future projects. But I think
they've already funded the existing project, so they're not going to doctor the evidence.
Right. But people do tend to mold their views to the views of their funding sources. That's definitely something that happens. And so Jerry Coyne and others are saying, don't sell your soul to the Templeton Foundation. And they think that a lot of people are. So they think that a lot of people, their work is compromised once they have Templeton Foundation money. And I think that's a good noise to be making. It's a good thing to be concerned about. But on the other end of this, you've got the Templeton Foundation that's giving out millions of dollars in research every year, and they're going to give it out no matter what. So if you're a good scientist and you know how to think critically, and you understand the importance of the separation between science and religion, if you refuse that money on principle, you're just handing that over to someone that doesn't understand the importance of the separation of science and religion. So by not applying for those grants, to reject that money on principle, I think is a really stupid thing to do. I actually kind of find it weird that Jerry Coyne, who spends his career studying how animals exploit new opportunities in their environments, I find it odd that he's not able to see this huge new opportunity in his own environment and exploit it. I do understand his concern, but I'm curious, how much did the Templeton people, how much were they watching over your back and changing the things that you were wanting to talk about and influencing your behavior? What were they doing?
So again, I asked the project about this. They'd sort of explained that, according to them, they've been model funders, just like you say, like any funding body. They were interested in the research throughout the project, but according to them, they never once interfered in any way with that research or in the research design process at any point, or in the analysis, and certainly not the conclusions of that data. So yeah, they were really hands-off. From me making this comic, which people have kind of commented on and accused of being like infiltrated by the trust, I think is quite funny, because like I didn't even know about these guys, right? Like I was applying my own mind. I read through all of the papers of the research. I interviewed the researchers about what their findings have been. And then I kind of drew my own conclusions, pulled it together in my own way, tried to put my own kind of narrative to it through my own personal commentary. And that's it. I mean, I don't even have an email address for the Templeton people. So yeah, and that's why it strikes me as particularly a shame, because it seems as though people like Coyne and other commenters I've read have just sort of taken that interpretation of what you're talking about, some of the other tangential aims of the foundation are, i.e., to synthesize science and religion, or like funding research about prayer or whatever you were saying, and thinking that has similar aims. But I'm not convinced that the Templeton Religion Trust has those same aims. Even if you did, like it said, why not just do good, solid research using that money to begin with? And certainly me as an individual comic creator who sort of has a complex and intimate relationship with religion and my own views on those and applying my own kind of lens to it, yeah, not really involved at all. So I think to take that tack and just kind of bleed that interpretation into the subtext of what I'm trying to say, that's kind of disappointing, because that's, I think, really thoroughly missing the point as far as I'm concerned. In fairness to him, like, I agree with what he's saying. So if you were to interpret what I was saying as what he was saying it was saying, which it wasn't, then I kind of I broadly agree with him. You know, a lot of what he's talking about is what he talks about in Faith versus Fact, which is his book, which he kept kind of mentioning those kind of key points. And I'm like, yeah, no, again, like I broadly agree with all of those points that you're making about that, but that's not what I'm talking about. So, and then again, kind of disappointingly, a lot of people who I think commented on that didn't then read the actual comic themselves. So they were just looking at the panels that he kind of pulled out and provided his commentary on. So I was kind of pleased to see, I've been now compared a couple of times to Jack Chick. I'm not sure if any of the listeners are familiar with Jack Chick. He's the creator of the so-called Chick tracts. You may have seen these put through your mailbox or given to you by a street preacher. It's overt Christian propaganda, right?
He was a Christian preacher that used comic book art to do it.
Yeah. He made thousands of these things. You can go online and read them, which I encourage you to do, but beware. it's some freaky stuff. They're just about this big, a few pages, little booklet. But so on the one hand, I'm quite flattered because this guy's a prolific and at times really talented comic book artist. But on the other, the comparison, I think the contents of his work were brutal and incredibly offensive. So that comparison is a little hurtful, because it's hey, for one, I'm not trying to convert anybody to Christianity. And two, I'm not saying anyone's going to be burn in the eternal hellfires of science hell or whatever if they don't accept this. So it was a weird comparison to make, but I really enjoyed it because I'm I have a weird fascination with Jack Chick. So
I actually might do a series of videos on the Templeton Foundation. I'm not associated with them in any way, but I've seen the opportunities that they're giving people and the backlash to it. And I think what I would love to see is good scientists doing good projects to eat up all that money. The Templeton Foundation really does seem to care about doing good research, even if it's on prayer. They're interested in good research on prayer. And I don't see it as a bad thing to have a bunch of well-studied research on prayer. I'm not threatened by what's going to be found. I'm pretty sure I know what's going to be found if we dig deeper into that phenomena. So good scientists that know what they're doing and know how to not let a funder corrupt what they're doing, they should apply for this if the Templeton Foundation's funding is funding the type of research they want to do anyways.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, actually. I didn't really think of it from that angle, but yeah, sure, why not? Although, I guess then people could still be justified in their skepticism. For example, if I see a health study funded by the Coca-Cola company,
yeah,
and if the research was genuinely really good, I would still be sort of yeah, but come on. So I guess I'll always now have that attached to me. Maybe my atheist street cred is tarnished now because I'm tied to Templeton. But yeah, that's an interesting point. Why not put it to good use instead of let some hack come along and actually try and use that money to warp the results to their own benefit.
Right. like I said, it's a huge just opportunity. It's a huge chunk of money sitting there to fund research. If you have a research idea, go get the big chunk of money and do good research.
And in this, so this is
make a really good comic book.
Yeah, man. I mean, so as far as I'm concerned, that money helped fund a freelance comic artist. It's not like there's a lot of money in that. So wherever, if that's coming from somewhere where you can think critically, apply these issues, try and bring some nuance to a often like really black and white conversation, I think that that's positive. Again, maybe, gosh, I don't even have any way of knowing whether or not the people from Templeton have read my comic. Maybe they don't fully agree with it, or they wish it said things more strongly or whatever. But one thing I don't think you can say that the comic is engaged in, and certainly not the research project, is that it's doing theology. It's psychology, it's sociology, it's historical sort of evaluations of things. So no, it's certainly an interesting issue. I think it's probably good to like mention it and bring it into the light as far as transparency and stuff goes, and sort of discussions about potential research bias and that kind of stuff. But
I do think that it's good to have people like Jerry Coyne and others. I'll link to an article criticizing the Templeton Foundation. It's very good to be aware of the experiences that people are having with them, and more in biology, because it is starting to fund more and more research into biology. One of the really good things about it, they're funding a lot of research in epigenetics, because I think, I don't know, somehow someone somewhere thinks that epigenetics might have something to do with religion, or Templeton's goal to kind of find a reconciliation between the two. But epigenetics is this field of research that is we don't understand it very well. And it's great that it's getting funding now from a non-government source. We can't always trust governments to fund science. We just elected Donald Trump and a bunch of anti-science people to run our country. So it's good to have multiple pots that you can pull from when you're trying to do research. If the Templeton Foundation makes people more skeptical of your work, well, it just means you need to do better work, and you need to go the extra mile to make sure that your research is rock solid. I wouldn't discourage people at all from using that money if they know how to not sell their soul and if they know how to recognize if someone's pressuring them to do something.
I'm certainly, I have a nice clean conscience, assured that I certainly have not sold my soul or anything like that. It feels, if anything, just the opposite. So, yeah.
Because of all this stuff with the Templeton Foundation and the accusations of accommodationism between science and religion, I want to talk about kind of what that means to you, and should we be at all trying to accommodate science and religion, or reconcile is the word, to reconcile science and religion. I've been really interested in the Biologist Foundation.
Yeah.
Maybe not interested. By the way, they're funded by the Templeton as well. I use the Biologist Foundation all the time when I'm doing presentations in schools and someone wants to start fighting me about religion stuff. I just say, I'm not religious, but there is this group of Christians. They're evangelical Christians. They have a website called the Biologist Foundation, and they are over there trying to address this conflict. So go visit that later. And it's an awesome tool to just kind of deflect a distraction during class. That's what I'm using it for. And I've gone on their website. I've read, I probably spent 10 or 12 hours or so reading. They have a lot of stuff that's about religion. And if you want to believe in Adam and Eve, how do you do that when you accept evolution? That stuff I actually don't like a whole lot, but their stuff on science there's no compromise. They're just teaching the science. They have stuff on genetics and so on. And that's why I trust them. I don't know a lot about their theological views, and I don't know how a Christian would interpret what they're doing. But as far as the stuff, when they're writing about science, they don't compromise the science. And that's why I think that they're valuable. The thing that was most helpful for me, I told you I was scared when I was first learning about evolution.
Yeah.
In high school, I read an article written by a professor at BYU. I wish I could find it. I've not been able to find it. I think it was on the internet at one time, but I think he took it down. Maybe he got in trouble for it. I don't know. But it said, I am a Mormon and I am an ape. And that was like the kind of the catch phrase of the article. And he was a professor at BYU, professor of evolutionary biology. He studied insect evolution. And he said in there that we don't know. He said that he doesn't know how to reconcile this with his religion, and he's okay with that. He's okay with it being a mystery. And it was that idea that really made me like, okay, I can study this stuff now. It's okay for me to study this stuff. I don't have to be ashamed of it or hide it or be scared of what I'm learning. I can just be okay with the fact that the things don't mix. And in biologos, I see them doing the opposite. They're trying to find a way to mix them. And that kind of bugs me a little bit. I think that aside from that, I think that they're an awesome resource because I can just send people there when they're trying to cause trouble. Basically, that's what I use it for. I send troublemakers to biologos.
Because I guess they have biologos. They appear to have a different goal, a completely different goal than what you do. I guess they're talking about the science. They have a different, they have a theological angle that you certainly don't have. It's a really interesting kind of question. I don't necessarily find accommodationism to be like an insult. If maybe I would be accused of being called of being an accommodation as well as you have. I'm not sure I'm that uncomfortable with it, but like you say, it depends on what you mean. If you're accommodating religion in science at the expense of the science, I think that's probably a problem.
Right.
On the other hand, I'm sure, a younger version of myself, my former pastor and friends and family, they would, on the same token, have a problem if you're accommodating science at the expense of, your faith. So I guess it works both ways. But I mean, beyond that, I think that being accommodating from a societal perspective is really important. I think that's a completely different issue as well, where, again, you're kind of bypassing almost when you're throwing people over to biologos. You don't really care about what, they're doing their own thing, but you recognize the social utility of that thing that they're doing, regardless of whether, you agree with the minutiae of that.
Right.
So I think in that respect, yes. When it comes to evolution, like teaching about evolution, I'm inclined to prioritize people over epistemology.
Yeah, I am too. I feel like, so again, I don't want to be like hating on Jerry Coyne or anything, but he actually, in an email, he told me that I'm an accommodationist. He works at a college and he can just tell people what he thinks and tell people that religion is stupid and tell people why. But you can't do that in high school. My stuff is designed for middle school and high school use. And for me to expect a student to give up their religion, their culture, and their family, and everybody they trust and love, their worldview, so they can accept this one branch of science.
Yeah.
One concept within, well, I think it's an amazing concept. It's not just one concept. It's extremely powerful and wonderful. But to expect them to give up their entire worldview so that they can accept this bit of science is silly, and exactly. The fact that people like Biologos exist, or groups like Biologos, where they're trying to at least have a conversation, how can we accept both these things? I think that's a good thing. It's a good conversation to be having.
Well, sure. I mean, like, if you had have asked me when I was right up probably even to when I was about 20 years old, if you had have presented it as an ultimatum between my faith or this thing called evolution, this abstract scientific idea, and said I had to choose, I would choose my faith every time. And if that is the choice that people have to make, I mean, I guess it's no wonder why people choose in that case to reject evolution, because many feel the theological consequences of accepting evolution they're just too high. That cost outweighs the perceived benefit, I guess. And I think I can't remember the study, but like kind of past social surveys, again, this is sort of in the UK, but when people are asked for the primary reason why they rejected evolution, they cited that it excluded any role for God. Yeah. So they reject evolution because it excludes God. Well, that kind of suggests that if they didn't think that evolution necessarily excluded God, then they wouldn't reject evolution, right?
Right.
So I think if you were to get rid of anything that kind of shows people that that's possible, I think is probably a good thing. I can think of a really good example of this. If you'll indulge me a little bit, there's a situation that happened. It kind of blew up in the UK. I didn't hear about it until I moved here, but I did a science communication course a couple of years ago, and I came across it when I was kind of looking into what the state of affairs was with the creation evolution controversy here. And there's this fellow called Michael Reese. So he's got a weird job description. He's a professor of evolutionary biology. He's an educational expert and a Church of England minister.
Okay.
And he was back in 2008. He was asked to step down from his role as the director of education at the Royal Society. So that was the role of the Royal Society. For those of you who don't know, it's one of the UK's oldest and most esteemed scientific institutions, right? Like Newton and Boyle and everybody was there. So
what we think of when you think of science.
It's
Royal Society.
And their slogan is awesome. I can't remember it in Latin, but it's take no.
Nullius in verba.
That's it.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's a great institution. This guy was like the director of education there, and he gave a speech where he just merely submitted the idea that, in his expert opinion as an education expert, that teachers approach beliefs of their students respectfully when teaching evolution, and try to meet creationist students if they have them in the class. Try to meet them where they're at and be open about discussing it. Should the topic, so like, don't fabricate a debate or anything. But if it comes up, just kind of be respectful. Try to meet them where they're at. Anyway, this suggestion kind of takes the life of its own in the media. It's reported that he was in favor of actively teaching of creation in science lessons. Anyway, still, the Royal Society didn't like all of the negative press, I guess. And shortly after they kick him out, they wrote something like he'd led to damage to the esteemed reputation of the institution. Therefore, it's in like the best interest of the society that he goes.
Yeah, we see a lot of people lose their jobs over a weird tweet or something that's easily misinterpreted. That's unfortunate.
Yes, I don't know if Twitter was even out 2008, but it was. Yeah, it's basically the equivalent of that, right? Where something takes on a life of its own. He's gone.
It's understandable, because even if someone is, even if what they said wasn't as bad as what the media says it is, it doesn't. At a point, it doesn't matter. Like,
sure,
once the public is against you, you're done. You know.
The problem is, it wasn't the public that was against him. It was like the Royal Society were like, he's gone. And then once it came at least slightly in the public eye, people at the Royal Society were sort of like, wait a minute, this guy's a vicar? Like, why is he even part of our club? Like, get this guy out of here. And then what was most interesting.
Okay. Why would you exclude a vicar if they're doing legitimate work?
Exactly. And the guy's an evolutionary biologist. So it was just like so ironic that he gets booted out because he's a creation, because they think he's a creationist, basically. And it was like a lot of scientists commented in the media about this afterwards, saying like, oh, good riddance, right? There's no place for people like that in the scientific community. But as I said before, like, I can't help but feel that kind of move makes the exact same mistake that fundamentalists and creationists do in seeing science and religion as inherent rivals within society, or at least like a body like the Royal Society.
Right. I find that really strange that the Royal Society would be like that, because if you read anything from the Royal Society from 1820, it's every scientific paper is littered with references to God. But,
well, maybe they were overcompensating.
The pendulum swings, right, and it doesn't stop in the middle. I do not advocate that people talk about creationism in school, and in fact, that's why I love biologos, because I can just stop the conversation. I'm using it as a tool to get back on topic when I get derailed by a creationist when I'm doing a presentation in a classroom. And it's a powerful tool for that, because I don't want to say much about religion when I'm in a public classroom. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I don't know exactly what this guy was saying that you're talking about, but meeting people where they're at, that's extremely important at a middle school, high school level. At a college, the student needs to come to where the level of the class is.
Yeah, so to be clear, This guy's talking about primary school and high school.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you don't meet your students where they're at, then you're leaving students behind. And I mean, I guess there's a degree where you have to do that a little bit, but
no, but I mean, like, the alternative is that you just tell them, no, you're wrong. And like, don't ask that kind of question again, because, obviously that's hogwash. And then think about how alienating that is. Like, I think that kind of thing can really damage science, because you're alienating religious people, or like anybody in that classroom setting, and potentially discouraging them from like pursuing an interest in science. What if they were really interested, but they're just, wait a minute, like, how do I fit this in with what I believe? You ask the question, and then it's like, whoa, okay. So if people like Michael Rees aren't accepted within science, like, how could I? And I guess science, there's no place for people like me there.
Yeah.
Which is, I think that can be problematic. I mean, have a problem with people's religious beliefs if you want, but like you say, like, if people are doing good science, what can you critique about the science unless you think they have this secret agenda, which I think then is just being quite disingenuous, or I don't know. You maybe have some more faith in people, but like, I also question whether it's the job of the scientist to deconvert everyone from religion.
Well, that's a job that Jerry Coyne has taken on, Richard Dawkins has taken on. But you're right. There's the spreading of atheism, and then there's the teaching of science. I think a lot of evolutionary biologists, Dawkins and Coyne, have both taken on that task, because creationism really is the thing that stops people from being able to understand the science that they love. But yeah, those are definitely two separate projects. Biology does not tell us anything about God. It is difficult to reconcile evolutionary theory with Genesis chapters 1 and 2. But as far as God in general, and then, of course, different religious groups are finding ways to reinterpret the Bible to make sense of the scientific data. So
also, no, actually, good point talking about different religious groups, because, again, we can't be so naive as to think that the only religion that exists is like Protestant Christianity. There's a lot of other religious traditions outside of Christianity in general, who are also, Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism and Mormonism and so on. So is Mormonism a subcategory of Christianity? I don't know.
Mormons will say it is. Baptists will say it's not. It depends on who you ask. I would define Mormons as a Christian sect. Yes. Weird one, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal of scientists and like science communicators, I guess, like us, it shouldn't necessarily be to convince people that like their pre-existing beliefs are mistaken.
Well, you can if that's your goal. I mean, I'm fine with people having that goal.
If that's your goal, but I don't think it should be like the a priori goal of the scientific enterprise. I think that is merely to just try and show people, to make sure that people understand, number one, and number two, accept the science. And then how they interpret the meaning of that science, how they internalize it, and then, if they want, how they reconcile that with their personal worldviews, completely up to them. I think then that condemning somebody for doing that while at the same time understanding and accepting the science, I think that can be quite damaging. Antagonizing people for what they already believe, I don't think promotes scientific understanding. Probably. I mean, again, I don't want to make the same mistake. Like I've said this to you before, but I'm not suggesting that approaches like the approach of Richard Dawkins or Jerry Coyne is bad.
Right.
Because I think that there are contexts where that works. There were times in my life where I read Richard Dawkins' books when I was still kind of holding on to certain creationist beliefs, and that kind of hard-hitting strategy really sort of wakes you up to, oh gosh, I guess that belief is actually quite stupid, especially if you compare it to, the evidence, that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't be so bold as to suggest that approach is bad or that it shouldn't be used.
Yeah,
but
no, it definitely works.
I think it's naive to suggest that is the only approach that should be used. Right. There are clearly situations where people maybe need a little bit more massaging, right? Where you need to offer them some gradient of transition, or leave that open door. Say, hey, here's biologist. You check that out.
Yeah, my target audience is me when I was in high school. That's exactly who I think of whenever I'm doing anything for science communication. And that's worked. That there's apparently a large group of the population that thinks like I did when I was in high school, because I get letters all the time, people saying that this finally made sense. But that's not the only method of teaching science, obviously. Yeah, I think there's this issue where people think that there's one right way and one wrong way to do science communication, and that's obviously a stupid way to think. I talked about this with you. There's a difference between a Trojan horse and an airlock. So when it comes to accommodation, so a Trojan horse, you're tricking your audience and you're sneaking something in that they would otherwise not want. And so, the Templeton Foundation has been accused of being a Trojan horse to sneak religion into the scientific world. And Biologos has been accused of that as well. But I would say I see Biologos as much more of an airlock. The airlock is that room on the space station. It's between outer space and the rest of the space station. So if you think of science as all the people inside the space station, where they got everything all climate controlled and everything's rock solid, you got the astronauts that are way out there in outer space. They need to come in and visit the space station. You have a room where they can go and they get adjusted to the pressure difference, and there's very little oxygen from the space station that gets lost because you have these two doors, and it's a way for people to come in. I see Biologos as a way to invite religious people to come in and visit the world of science for a bit, and they can leave if they want safely without ruining what we're doing here. And I see Biologos as an airlock system rather than a Trojan horse. People can come and go, and by visiting this thing that we call science, even if people decide to go back out again afterwards, they will have learned something interesting during their visit. As a public science educator, like public school system, which is what I designed my animations for, that's what we should be doing. We should be inviting these people to come learn what science is. Just come visit at least for a little bit.
Yeah, I think I do think it's, regardless of whether you think that it should happen, you might think that religion is a horrible thing and let's get rid of it. Maybe that would be the best thing. But I think it's wrong to ask or expect religious people to give up their entire identity and worldview just in order to accept scientific facts.
Right.
It seems like there's a big disparity there. And whether or not that eventually leads them to accepting a scientific worldview instead of that religious worldview, I mean, that's a different thing. But yeah, no, I love that metaphor because of the airlock, because I guess that would just be sort of like just suddenly pulling them in from a vacuum into a pressurized area.
Right.
And, that's going to cause some catastrophic damage to one or the other.
They say it takes 35 minutes to adjust in the airlock before you can go into the space station and not just be totally messed up by the change in pressure. So,
well, it makes me think as well when you were talking about that, like that there are different people, maybe in an oceanic context where people are at various depths in the ocean, and they're pressurized to different depths, and the speed at which you bring somebody up to the surface will vary depending on how long they've been under, what the depth in the first place. If you pull somebody up too fast, it's going to give them the bends.
Right.
Whereas at times that might be right. If just at the right time, if you yank them up really quickly, maybe that'll be effective as a rescue scenario. But I even think hearing this come out of my mouth, it's certainly clear, what my own bias is. I'm not.
Right.
Religion is the murky, bottomless depths, and science is the clear. We need to rescue people, because again, I don't think that is the. I don't think that's the job remit of science as an enterprise and all science communicators. There are rescue people, and there are other people who explore those depths. Right? They go down in scuba gear, they check it out, and find out what's going on. So.
One of my favorite YouTubers, science communicators, is Destin from Smarter Every Day. I don't know if you ever watch that channel.
I sure do. Every video.
Oh yeah. He is absolutely great. But he's an evangelical Christian. He does not let it corrupt his science. He does not let it corrupt his science teaching. But it's really funny. I bumped into him randomly at the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C. I've got a picture of him, which I'm showing on screen right now when this is all edited. He and I took a selfie together, and it was really funny because there was an elephant behind us. There's this elephant in the room. But his stuff is absolutely great. The creationist movement has done major damage for Christians that are interested in science.
Yeah.
For me, I was scared to learn science. We're losing tons of brilliant minds to the creationist movement because there's this phobia, there's a separation. And when you have someone like Destin, who's like, hey, look, I love science and I'm an evangelical Christian like you, that gives people this permission to follow their passion into science, even though they might have people in their circles that are skeptical of that, even though they might be scared of it a little bit.
Right.
It's really important to have people like Destin out there that are so
right. And it's interesting you mentioned him because I remember because he's been YouTubing for years now, and I remember a few years ago I was pretty, I guess, diehard in my atheist approach to things, and I was watching a lot of atheist YouTube video stuff as well. I mean, YouTube. I should have mentioned back towards the beginning of the conversation. YouTube was instrumental in my decompression state. Like that was what started to expose me to different views outside my own social circles. But anyway, I caught after watching him for a few years, he sometimes has that little mouse icon from, I think, the Chronicles of Narnia, right. And a couple numbers like 6
it's
2.
like a Psalms or something. Yeah.
Sometimes depends on the content of the video, but I immediately recognize it as a Bible verse and something from Chronicles of Narnia, which is, I guess you can broadly conceive it as creationist fantasy. I'm really sorry. Christian fantasy literature. That really turned me off. I think I even stopped watching his videos for a bit because I was like, oh, he's a Christian, and like that really tarnished me. And I was like, watching other videos of his, like seeing what he was trying to sneak in and stuff, and like I was applying that, right? I was going. Right. And it really jarred with me because he's so smart and he loves science and he's so curious and he investigates things. And I was like, how is this possible? How is this guy quoting Bible verses at the end of these awesome videos about kind of just science and curiosity about our world and stuff? And I can see now, that's kind of a naive view. He clearly does it, and he does it amazingly well. And that would have been, I wished that I had been aware of people like him when I was a Christian, right? Because that would have gone such a long way to me going, hey, look at this guy. Like, rather than the distaste I felt for it when I was kind of like a new atheist. And I don't mean new atheist like capital N-A, like movement. I mean like a fresh atheist, although I guess both. It would have probably done wonders to have somebody like that as a role model. I think that's really important. And also, I want to say something about what you mentioned about the brilliant minds that we're probably just losing to this phenomenon, right? Of people who are probably really curious about the natural world. They could probably come up with the unified theory of everything. But guess what? They were raised in a creationist household. They're told that science is bad. That person's never going to pursue science. I kind of explore that very briefly in the comic. I maybe slightly too briefly because I've noticed it's distracted a couple people. They think I'm trying to say something that it's not. But I have a panel where I show some of our great sort of Western scientific icons throughout history, sort of Isaac Newton, Gregor Mendel, Max Planck, Johannes Kepler, and so on. So I kind of throw them in there and I use them as an example there. So these are historical examples of these sort of people you can look up to. If you were a Christian, you'd be like, look at these guys. They're super devout and also did amazing science. But my commentary,
guys, and Mary Anning, I'm looking at it right now.
and I got Mary Anning because she was very religious. She has a stained glass window dedicated to her in the church outside the town where she was buried. But I snuck her in there, and she's saying gentleman because everyone else is like a white dude, right? Western history. But my commentary on that, because to me, what I think about when I reflect on that is that I can't help but think of all of the discoveries humanity would have missed out on had these people felt that their beliefs excluded them from pursuing science, right? Because these people were all devoutly religious, if they lived in like kind of like a cultural climate like we have today, if I were to extrapolate that devout religiosity to what I felt, we would have just had Isaac Newton, the Bible code breaker, and the alchemist, maybe, rather than Isaac Newton. It's historical fiction, but it makes me think, like, are we doing the same thing today? Think of all of the students lost in a classroom who just completely disengage or turn off when science or biology is brought up in class. We're out on some awesome stuff here. I think that's really a little bit disheartening.
Yeah. One last point that I want to make before ending. I don't know if you want to say anything else too, but I do find it interesting that most of the people that are doing science outreach on evolution came from evangelical backgrounds.
Journalism 101, everyone loves a human interest story. You look for a human interest angle on astrophysics and stuff like that. If you want to get a story about astrophysics, you talk about the team that built the probe that's finding out whatever.
Right.
And then some sense of human drama to it. If you want to try and engage the public about something in biology which is incredibly important, but they don't care about biology to begin with, and maybe have some loose awareness about what evolution is, but they don't otherwise care. I think there's a lot to be said about the fact that you're like, hey, this is quite socially important. There's this whole debate going on around it. It brings that human interest to something that people might not otherwise care about. And like you say, it's the reason why you and I are pursuing this, I think, so passionately. Like, evolution is my favorite subject. Even in literature, I look for kind of like these evolutionary themes and stuff. I just love it. And I question whether or not that would have happened had I not had the background I did. It's almost as if I've just sort of transplanted the creationist fervor that I had in my youth and then just like planted that within a evolutionary context. But there's something curious about that. I think you're onto something.
I'm not saying that it's worth the trouble, but
yeah, I mean, it would have been probably much better if had have just always accepted. But it's certainly, I would say, it's given me some insights into what's going on the other side, if you know what I mean. Whereas I think a lot of people are not very charitable if they haven't grown up in a religious environment, let alone deeply held those beliefs themselves, which are two different things. Then it can be very hard to understand what's going on with these crazy religious people, in quotes, because it's very easy I've seen people very easily dismiss them. Oh, they're crazy, they're stupid. And I don't think that is true. I think there's definitely more going on there, and dismissing them in that way is, I think, to miss quite a trick. You can engage with these people on a level, I think, if you try and listen to them and understand where they're coming from.
Well, tell us where to get the comic. People can get the hard copy still. Is it still available?
Yeah, that's right. So the hard copy, I would say, is probably the format I would recommend getting it in. It's the format that I kind of had designed it for. It feels a little bit lengthy when you're scrolling through and reading it on a screen, but you can get the paper copy if you email the Science and Religion Project. Yeah, you can visit their website as well to find out more about the project, if I didn't do a good enough job of explaining it. And you can just request a copy of it from them for free. They'll ship it out to you, I think, within reason, anywhere in the world. So give that a shot. Just zing them an email and they'll send you a copy. Otherwise, if you're too excited to read this thing and you want to read it now, you can head to their website and it's all up on there. Otherwise, you can read it on my personal website as well, on my portfolio. I've got a nice high-res version there if you want to read it there.
Your artwork is absolutely amazing. My favorite is this drawing of Bigfoot. I think we need to make this into a t-shirt because this is awesome.
Thanks. Yeah, I managed to put Bigfoot in there. He's definitely an interest of mine. Yeah,
I'm trying to get Jordan to write a script for Stated Clearly on Bigfoot. So we're working on that. We want to do a video about the science of Bigfoot.
That's right, and what it can tell us, what the hunt for Bigfoot can tell us about science.
Right, and now that this is public, you should all hassle him to hurry up and write that script.
Yeah, give us the Bigfoot script.
Yeah, give us the Bigfoot Stated Clearly animation.
Well,
all right.
This out there, John, you just need to look really hard for it. There have been a few pictures, but it's just really blurry of this script.
Okay, the script is blurry. It's hiding in the woods.
Yeah.
All right. This was absolutely great. I think we should probably do more of these chats about stuff.
I'd be up for that. I like chatting about stuff.
Yeah, I actually invited when I got this email from Jerry Coyne saying that I am an accommodationist. I invited him on the podcast to explain why to everybody, but he declined, unfortunately. Maybe viewers that have a connection to him can try and convince him to do that. I don't want people to hassle him and like send him a bunch of emails. But if you happen to know him personally and you think that would be an interesting conversation, let him know for me.
And also, similarly, if you have anything you want to say to me, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is at Jordan Collver. It's just my name, JordanCollver. And let me know what you think about the comic. I'd love to hear that. If you have critiques, I'd love to hear that.
But read it first. Read the whole thing first.
That would be great. Also, I'm open to just comments about the artwork and stuff as well, because we didn't get a chance to talk about it. But yeah, like one of my passions is using the medium of comics to explore these kinds of complicated subjects through visual metaphor and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I would also love feedback on that kind of thing as well.
My Twitter is at Stated Clearly. And yeah, I would love more people to follow me on Twitter, because it's like crickets every time I tweet. I don't get on there much because I haven't really fully engaged in that yet, but I'd like to. So at Stated Clearly is where you can find me.
And then just copy us into both of those, and then we'll both see it.
I'm a little concerned right now about your salvation and stuff. How come you have not been baptized?
Because I never got around to it, okay? I don't know why you always have to be judging me. Because I only believe in science.
But tonight, we are going up against Satan's caveman. And I just thought it would be a good idea